we have we are all here. So let us begin. And before this, I would just like to inform you that we are recording this talk, and we intend to live stream it on YouTube and the Facebook channel of the Institute, and hope you are fine with that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Punarjit Roy Chowdhury from University of Nottingham today. He is going to talk about the topic of his lecture today is "Don't Cross the Line: Bounding the Causal Effect of Hypergamy Violation on Domestic Violence in India." I'll not talk about the issue much, and I leave it to the speaker. And we are also very privileged today that we have Srimati Harjot Kaur Bamhrah among us. Professor Ghosh, sorry, who is a senior IAS officer in the government of Bihar, and she is the managing director of Women Development Corporation. So we expect to have a very interesting talk, and followed by that, we intend to have a very interesting discussion on the possible policy implications. So over to you, Punarjit, now.
Yes. Thank you, Ashmita, for inviting for this seminar, for this talk. I have heard, of course, a lot about ADRI from friends and people I know, but really never, presented my work here. So although this being a virtual seminar, I'm grateful that you invited me for this talk. So thank you very much. And as Ashmita had told me earlier, that this talk is going to be attended by people from disciplines other than economics and policymakers as well. So I'll keep my talk a little bit less technical than it should be. And I'll talk a little bit more about the policy implications, so that gives you some idea about how to, how my results carry over to the real world and what are the implications of that in terms of policy, right? So I'll just share my screen, and if you can't see my slides, please let me know. Yeah. So I hope I am audible and my slides are visible.
Yeah, you're audible, but it would be nice if you just speak a little louder.
Sure. I'll do that. Yeah.
Okay, and your screen is visible.
Yeah, so the title of the talk, as Shmita mentioned, is "Don't Cross the Line, Bounding the Causal Effect of Hypergamy Violation on Domestic Violence in India." It's a joint work with a former student of mine, Gaurav Kamija, who is currently an assistant professor at the IIT Hyderabad. Okay, so to motivate my talk, basically, the talk deals with domestic violence, and we all know perhaps that domestic violence is sort of a social epidemic, really. It affects 1 in 3 women in their lifetime, according to the WHO estimates. A large proportion of these women live in low-income countries. Women who suffer domestic violence, they experience severe health issues, both physical and mental. The cost of domestic violence, if you sort of add up, the cost in terms of victim sufferings, medical bills, and judicial expenditures to fight court cases, and so on and so forth. If you sum up all these things, the cost is huge to an economy, especially to a developing country like ours. According to one estimate, the cost of domestic violence, which one can also refer to as intimate partner violence or IPV, it costs the world around 5% of global GDP. which is way more than the total cost from conflicts. Given these consequences of domestic violence, of course, it is crucial for policymakers to design policies that could be used to reduce the problem of domestic violence, right? So, and for creation of such policies, of course, one needs to understand that what are the main determinants. First, what are the main determinants of domestic violence? In light of that, in this study, we look at one unexplored uh, contributing cause of domestic violence. So it's an unexplored cause, but we do think it's potentially important, and that is violation of hypergamy. So what is hypergamy? First things first, hypergamy occurs when in a marital relationship, the husband's economic status exceeds that of his wife. So basically, it's like the wife marrying upwards. And it is widespread in almost all patriarchal societies. So whenever the wife has a lower economic status compared to the husband at the time of marriage, we refer to that act of marriage as hypergamy, or we call that marital relationship as a hypergamous marriage. Now, what happens if the marriage is not hypergamous? If there's a violation of hypergamy, right? So if there's a violation of hypergamy, that undermines patriarchal beliefs and norms about gender roles. You know, norms like the man should be the primary breadwinner, and so on and so forth. This in turn could lead to stress, tension, and severe domestic violence as form of male backlash. So this is a school of sociology which says that there's this male backlash that can happen if the marriage is non-hypergamous, or if there's a violation of hypergamy that takes place. Additionally, there could be another reason why women in non-hypergamous marriages might be susceptible to more domestic violence compared to their counterparts. What is that? So that reason one can refer to as instrumental reason for domestic violence. So what does that mean? So husbands can often use domestic violence as an instrument to sort of sabotage their wives' labor market prospects, or to extract earnings from their wives. Now, whenever the wife's relative economic status, or the wife's economic status relative to their husband, that increases, the husband's tendency to use domestic violence as an instrument for whatever reason, the two reasons that I mentioned, or some other reason, that propensity goes up. So since hypergamy violation is ultimately an outcome of the increase in women's relative economic status, that sort of suggests that when hypergamy violation occurs, there is a likelihood that men would use domestic violence as an instrument, and therefore this could also lead to higher exposure of domestic violence of women who violate hypergamy or who are in non-hypergamous marriages.
So I have a question, Punarjit. Like when you look at the economic status of the women, is it only the earnings that you are looking at, or is it like the also sort of, because in India, most like the family's economic status is also, I think, equally important here.
That's right. So when I'm talking about economic status, it's basically the individual economic status I'm talking about. So you can conceive that in terms of education or earnings. Now, getting earnings data for over like a long period, that's difficult. So one proxy of economic status is education of the husband and the wife, that sort of I'm referring to. But you're right, the family's economic status is also important. So one has to sort of control for that confounder to see that doesn't affect the sort of channel that I'm talking about, or the effect I'm talking about. Right. So coming back to what I was talking about. So these are the two reasons why women who are in non-hypergamous marriages might be exposed to higher domestic violence. Now, one can just say that, there's this classical economic literature which suggests that when women's economic status relative to their husbands increases, that will lead to higher bargaining power for women, right? And if that is the case, then domestic violence should reduce. Of course, that is another possibility. And therefore, if you take into account all these channels together, whether violation of hypergamy leads to more domestic violence or not, or in other words, whether women who are in non-hypergamous marriages, they are exposed to more domestic violence or not, that is ultimately an empirical question. So, so I'll just talk a little bit about the literature and then go on to the econometric model. So this work contributes to the economic literature on the causes of domestic violence by providing the first evidence of the causal effect of hypergamy violation on domestic violence. This literature has looked at different factors, which includes labor market conditions, macroeconomic conditions, cultural and social norms. I have some work on women's age at marriage and how that impacts domestic violence, and so on and so forth. This work is also related to the studies in economics of family, which suggests that the decline in traditional family remains sort of a problem for many men due to prevalence of gender norms. Okay, so that's sort of the main question. And before getting into the empirical, the econometric model, I'll just give you a sort of interesting sort of insight here, which you can think about while I'm talking, is that, if what I'm suggesting or what I'm looking at, if I find evidence in favor of that hypergamy violation or women who are in non-hypergamous marriages, they are exposed to more domestic violence, then that would raise questions about how to structure policies that sort of aim at bringing about gender equality in society. Because if policies that are meant to sort of foster gender equality work, that essentially could mean that women outcompete their husbands in terms of economic status, or in other words, the proportion of non-hypergamous marriages that increases in the society, right? If that is the case, and if that one side effect of that is that women get sort of exposed to more domestic violence, then an important thing to sort of think about here is that, so how do we sort of combat that side effect that these gender equality enhancing policies would generate? So I'll come to that aspect later on, but I just wanted to give you sort of an insight into sort of a policy angle of the question that that I'm going to talk about. Okay, so a little bit about the empirical strategy. To examine the causal relationship between violation of hypergamy and women's exposure to domestic violence, we focus on the partial identification of the average treatment effect. Why partial identification, or how does it work? I'll talk about it. But what does average treatment effect mean? The average treatment effect is defined by this equation that you see on your screen. So in this equation, Y is basically the realized domestic violence outcome, which is binary, that whether you've been exposed to domestic violence in the last 12 months or not. Y1 denotes the potential domestic violence faced by a woman if she were in a non-hypergamous marriage, and Y0 denotes the potential domestic violence faced by a woman if she were in a hypergamous marriage. So it's basically the difference in potential exposure to domestic violence if the women were in a non-hypergamous marriages versus the women were in a hypergamous marriage. Now, therefore, the AT basically reveals how the mean outcome would differ if all women were in non-hypergamous marriages versus the mean outcome if all women were in hypergamous marriages. Now, there's a problem here. So you cannot sort of directly identify this or sort of estimate this using the data that you have. What is the problem here? The problem here is that Y1 is a counterfactual or is unobserved for all women who are in hypergamous marriages. So, because I can observe a woman either in a hypergamous marriage or in a non-hypergamous marriage, I cannot observe one woman in both the states of the world. So, Y1 is unobserved for all women who are in hypergamous marriages, and Y0 is unobserved for all women who are in non-hypergamous marriages. And this problem is basically the classical selection problem. Now, this does not allow us to identify the two components that you just saw. The two components you cannot just compute by pen and paper. You can't do that. Why? Because if you sort of break up the first component, also the second component could be broken up like this. If you just break up the first component using the law of total probability, you will see that it becomes an addition of four terms, or sort of addition of two terms. So basically we have four terms here, out of which three you can directly compute from the data, because those are either probabilities or conditional probabilities. But there's one term here which sort of is unobserved. So that does not allow you to compute the first term, and similarly you can show that you cannot compute the second term as well. So in light of this identification problem, what we try to do here, in absence of course, other instrumental variables and conventional methods, what we try to do here is we derive bounds on the average treatment effect. So what we'll do is, so the thing is that we don't know what this is. This expression is, we can't compute. But what we'll do, the idea of the empirical strategy is that we'll invoke some assumptions, some very sort of basic and transparent assumptions, and try to come up with bounds on the average treatment effect. So I won't be able to tell you that, if you are in hypergamous marriages, or if you are in a non-hypergamous marriage versus a hypergamous marriage, your exposure to domestic violence would increase by 10%. What I'll be able to tell you is that if you're in a non-hypergamous marriage versus in a hypergamous marriage, your exposure will increase by something between 5 and 15%. So that's what I'll be able to tell you using this method. So in light of this identification problem, we derive bounds on the ATE under minimal and transparent assumptions. The first assumption that we invoke, I'm not getting into the details of the assumption, but the first assumption is basically no assumption. So that's the most naive case, where we don't make any assumption on the bounds, but we just make use of a statistical property that these conditional probabilities, these two conditional probabilities that you see on your screen, these two conditional probabilities by construction would lie between 0 and 1. And using this insight, we place bounds, these are called the worst case bounds, because we are not using any assumptions, and therefore the bounds are definitely going to be huge. And we compute these bounds on the average treatment effect. Right now, these bounds, as I just mentioned, these bounds don't sort of select any sort of assumption. So these bounds are not based on any particular assumption. So these are the worst case bounds. They have a width equal to unity, and therefore it includes 0 for sure. And therefore, using these bounds, you cannot possibly sign the average treatment effect. Right? So this is sort of the first sort of the benchmark result, and then we sort of invoke more assumptions and try to narrow the bounds. The next assumption that we invoke is called the monotone treatment selection, or MTS assumption. This assumption basically places structure on the selection mechanism. So this assumption assumes that the expected potential outcome moves in a particular direction conditional on treatment assignment. In our context, basically what we assume is that, to start with, women in hypergamous marriages are more likely to face domestic violence than women in non-hypergamous marriages, conditional on treatment assignment. So basically what that means is, if you pick up women from the non-hypergamous marriage category, and you randomly pick another woman from the hypergamous marriage hypergamous marriage, then the women who has been randomly picked up from this hypergamous marriage category, she is likely to have faced more domestic violence than her counterpart. Now, why this assumption makes sense, why women in hypergamous marriages are likely to be exposed to more domestic violence to start with a conditional or treatment assignment. So there are multiple ways to justify this assumption. The first way is that the prevalence of patriarchal attitudes in the and marital home of women in hypergamous marriages is likely to be higher because hypergamy is ultimately a tenet of patriarchy, and these women who are in hypergamous marriages, they adhere to this tenet, right? This also is therefore likely to suggest that women in hypergamous marriages are more likely to consider domestic violence as a norm because patriarchy sort of naturalizes domestic violence. Because patriarchy teaches you that domestic violence is fine. You don't have to complain, or you should just think that this is a natural process that everybody has to go through. So therefore, these women consider that as a social norm, and therefore are more predisposed to domestic violence. Now, even if these women who are in hypergamous marriages do not consider domestic violence as a norm, they may be more predisposed to domestic violence than their counterparts due to extortionary reasons or dowry. Now, dowry demands are likely to be higher for women in hypergamous marriages because dowry demands are higher in patriarchal environments, and hypergamy again is a sort of manifestation of patriarchy. And dowry demands are positively correlated to domestic violence. It's been shown again and again in the literature. And therefore, women in hypergamous marriages who face higher dowry demands, they are also likely to face higher domestic violence. So that's sort of the second assumption. The third assumption is to further sort of narrow down the bounds. So the idea is that narrower is the bound, more information you have about the average treatment effect. So the third assumption is called the MIV, or the monotone treat as a monotone instrumental variable. To derive more informative inferences about the average treatment effect, we use new information through MIVs. Now, MIVs are not conventional IVs. For MIVs, the only condition that needs to be satisfied for an MIV to be valid is that the potential outcomes must monotonically vary with the MIV. So that's the only condition that one has to satisfy. The MIV has to satisfy. And what that means in mathematical terms is this, not getting into that. But this is sort of an additional assumption, in addition to MTS, that will help us narrow the bounds. The two MIVs that we use in our context is state level literacy rate and state level GDP per capita. I'll come to this, how this sort of works as an MIV in a moment. Okay, so that was basically my empirical strategy. Now coming to the data. The data that I use, most of you have heard about this survey. This is the National Family Health Survey, the NFHS, the fourth round, which is a nationwide cross-section demographic health survey covering more than 6 lakh households and so on. Now, NFHS administered a women's questionnaire to all eligible women between 15 and 49 years in all households. And for a subset of these women, domestic violence information is available. How the selection process works and all, I'm sort of skipping that. You can look at my paper or the documentation of NFHS. Now, using the domestic violence information that we get from NFHS, we create 4 binary outcome variables indicating women's exposure to a particular category of domestic violence, and these are less severe physical violence, sexual violence, and emotional violence. A given outcome variable takes a value 1 for a woman if she reports to have faced at least one kind of the underlying violences in the last 12 months and 0 otherwise. In addition to this, we create another binary outcome variable and we call that any violence. Now, what is that? So that variable takes a value 1 for a woman if she reports to have been exposed to at least one of the 4 kinds of domestic violence, the 4 kinds that you see in the first bullet point, and 0 otherwise. Okay, the treatment variable is violation of hypergamy, right? So we measure violation of hypergamy using a binary indicator based on couples on the couples observed educational attainment. So specifically, the variable takes a value 1, the treatment variable takes a value 1. If a woman's observed educational attainment is at least as high as that of her husband, which means that hypergamy is violated, and 0 if her observed educational attainment or the years of schooling is strictly lower than that of her husband, which means hypergamy is not violated. Right? So 1 denotes that hypergamy is violated. The woman is at least as, in terms of economic status, is at least, her economic status is at least as high as that of her husband. 0 is that hypergamy is not violated. The husband enjoys a higher economic status. Previous research has also used couples observed education to measure hypergamy in marital relationships, and maybe basically follow that literature. The sort of justification for using education is that individuals' educational attainment is likely to become fixed before marriage, and also it is likely to be reflective of individuals' long-term social status. If we had good income data or good other labor market indicators, we could have used that to sort of check the robustness or as an alternative measure. But unfortunately, we don't have good indicators of income or other labor market outcomes. So we use education. So the MIV that we use, as I mentioned, is state level literacy rate and state GDP per capita. And we call that MIV1 and MIV2. So just to remind you, the only condition that needs to be satisfied, that the MIV needs to satisfy, is that the potential outcome has to vary monotonically with the MIV values, the variable which is used as the MIV. So higher levels of literacy, as well as GDP per capita, both are likely to reflect higher local economic development, right? And lower, this sort of implies that this would lower the likelihood of women facing domestic violence, whether on immaterial of whether or not they violate hypergamy. So women who are in more literate states or who are in more richer states, they are likely to face less domestic violence, irrespective of their treatment status. So that sort of is the main assumption that sort of drives us to use these two variables as MIVs. Okay, so the results. The first set of results is sort of the main results. So these are the 4 graphs which show the bounds. As I mentioned, we'll be just finding the bounds. These show the bounds for the different outcome variables, computed bounds on AT for the different outcome variables, computed under different assumptions. The first bound in each figure is the bound without invoking any assumptions, out of the no selection assumption case. The second bound is computed or estimated under the MTS assumption. The third and fourth bounds are the bounds that are estimated under the assumption of MTS plus MIV1, the third bound, and fourth bound, it corresponds to MTS plus MIV2. The black lines are the estimated bounds, and the gray sort of areas show the confidence intervals. Now, what do you see here? You see here, when we look at the cases where no assumptions are invoked, the bounds are bounds include 0, so you really cannot conclude anything from that. But whenever you look at the bounds that suppose just uses MTS and not MIV, one thing becomes very clear, that the bounds are non-negative. And most of the bounds are actually positive. Under the MTS assumption, most of the bounds are positive, implying that the average treatment effect is positive. The actual average treatment effect is positive, or at least non-negative. If you invoke the MIV assumption in addition to the MTS assumption, you see that the bounds are strictly positive, implying that the average treatment effect is strictly positive. Now, what does the strictly positive AT or strictly positive average treatment effect mean? That means that women who are in non-hypergamous marriages, on average, their likelihood to be exposed to domestic violence is higher than their counterparts. So women who violate hypergamy or women who are in non-hypergamous marriages are exposed to more domestic violence. And that's true for all categories of domestic violence. If you look at this figure, which sort of summarizes all the information, because this is sort of any violence indicator, whether you've been exposed to any kind of violence in the past 12 months, again, you see similar results, that whenever you invoke sort of combine the MTS and MIP assumption, the bounds become strictly positive, indicating that hypergamy violation leads to more domestic violence. So just to summarize the results, AT is positive and statistically significant for all categories of domestic violence. Under MTS and MIP assumptions, the bounds of the AT of hypergamy violation reveal that violation of hypergamy increases likelihood of women's exposure to any kind of domestic violence by at least 17% when you use MIV1 and by 14% when you use MIV2. These are just the lower bounds, right? Now, since these are the lower bounds of the true AT is of course above that, these results basically suggest that the hypergamy violation leads to severe increase in domestic violence. And this is actually sort of fits in with the recent literature, very recent literature. These are 3 papers here which have been published just this year. All of these papers for different countries show that women, when their relative economic status sort of increases, relative economic status means economic status relative to their husbands, that increases, they become more susceptible to domestic violence. Their exposure to domestic violence increases. And our result actually completely is consistent with this, with these 3 papers. Now, come to the mechanisms. Now, what drives our results? We had argued that, initially, we had argued that there could be 2 channels. One is that these results could be arising because of the male backlash effect, that, I don't like the patriarchal norms to be violated, and therefore I sort of inflict my wife with domestic violence. So the violation of gender norms could be one reason. The second reason could be that the husbands could be using domestic violence as an instrument to, sabotage their wives' labor market prospects, or just to sort of extract money from their wives. So, which of these 2 channels are important, or whether both of these channels are important, we want to see that. To examine the first channel, we estimate the average treatment effect of hypergamy violation on a series of binary variables, indicating whether or not women have higher or at least equal say in different types of household decision making. For example, purchase of large household goods, visiting relative friends and family, visiting relatives, friends and families, and so on. The idea is that if we find the effect of average treatment effect of hypergamy violation on these indicators to be positive, that sort of means that there is some kind of evidence that gender norms, gender norms are what? That the husband should have the higher say. But if we find that husband does not have the higher say, the women has equal say or higher say, then that means gender norms are violated. The second channel, how do we estimate that? We estimate the second channel, basically estimate the average treatment effect of hypergamy violation on a series of binary variables that indicate whether the husband or the woman displays behavior that could lead to instrumental domestic violence. So, whether there's evidence suggesting that the husband could be sort of displaying some behavior that could be consistent with the instrumental theory of domestic violence. And what are those indicators we look at? Whether the husband extract wife's earnings, whether the husband feels jealous if the wife talks with other men, and so on. Again, if the average treatment effect is positive, that means the husband is more likely to exhibit behavior that is sort of a precondition for domestic violence to be used instrumentally. I'm not getting into the results here. I have two slides with one with violation of gender norms. What happens when hypergamy is violated? So does it lead to violation of gender norms? And what happens when hypergamy is violated? Does it lead to instrumental usage of domestic violence? I just summarize the main results. The first thing to note is that the average treatment effect for all indicators of average treatment effect is positive for all indicators of gender norm violation and of behavior that could lead to instrumental domestic violence. So gender norm is violated, and also husbands display behavior which is consistent with instrumental domestic violence when hypergamy is violated. So overall, basically, this exercise provides suggestive evidence that the main result that we find in this paper arises because violation of hypergamy is likely to undermine patriarchal beliefs and norms about gender roles, and also because hypergamy violation is likely to increase men's likelihood of using domestic violence as an instrument to sabotage their wives' labor market prospects. We carry out, of course, a host of robustness checks. Checks are there in the paper, in the appendix. So those of you who are in academics and want to look at these checks, you're welcome to do so. So to conclude, what do we find and what are the policy sort of implications of our findings? One is that our findings underscore that policy making, especially policy making that relates to improving lives of women, that is extremely complex, right? So the policies that one has to sort of construct, or policies that one has to sort of come up with to address the problem of domestic violence, there are inherent complexities in that. One would suggest that policies to promote gender equality are likely to be useful to reduce domestic violence, right? Because whenever we talk about domestic violence, people say that women empowerment policies like educating women, sort of creating opportunities for them to earn, earn more in labor markets, make them more employed. These are likely to be useful in sort of reducing domestic violence. Well, it turns out that that might not always be the case. If it so happens that you empower a woman and that sort of leads to some kind of disbalance in the sort of men-women power within the marriage, or that leads to big sort of violation of hypergamy, that paradoxically could lead women to face higher domestic violence. And therefore, to effectively tackle the problem of domestic violence, it's not, just to make something very clear, we are not at all suggesting that policies that are meant to sort of foster gender equality, that shouldn't be carried out. I mean, no sane person would say that. What we are suggesting is that gender equality policies are important because that could be sort of leading to higher domestic violence if hypergamy is violated. But there are other benefits also. So we are not saying that you should sort of completely do away with all gender equality policies. What we are suggesting is that you should have sort of policies that would lead to higher gender equality, or education policies for girls, higher employment policies for girls, and so on and so forth. But such policies should be complemented by some kind of interventions that aim at changing gender norms of the society. Sort of making sort of interventions that would make men think that women are equal rather than women are subordinates. There should be enforceable legislation that offer women legal protection from domestic violence, because then the avenue remains open. Sort of when they are subject to domestic violence, they know what to do, right? They know what to do. They know walking out of marriage isn't difficult. There should be removal of restrictions of women's access to divorce. That still is a taboo in a society, and it's also not very sort of easy for even high income earners or women who are in the higher strata of the society. So that's what we feel should be sort of policy implication, or what the policy implication of this research should be or is. Since there are many policymakers, many people who work on the ground here, it would be fantastic if you could sort of add on to this, or sort of help me sort of make this more concrete, or just tell me what you think about this problem, and how this problem could be sort of addressed in our country. So that's all what I have. Thank you very much once again, Ashmita and others, for attending my talk. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask.
Thank you, Punarjit. This was a very, very interesting paper. And I'm sure there would be a lot of, sort of what you're saying sort of is kind of expected. And this is what you also quoted some of the recent literature, which is finding like sometimes when we make, when we have targeted policies, which are well intentioned, but unintentionally they end up actually doing something else, which we would not have possibly thought of. And another important observation, I think, sort of is it sort of expected that when we have, say, higher status of women in a marriage, I feel that this is also sort of related to the conflict literature, like when there is two groups and one group becomes economically well off, there's bound to be conflict among the two. So in this context, I just want to ask you, like, since you take education as a measure of hypergamy, which you said because of lack of, and is it that you are concluding that that could also explain part of the reason of why there's such low labor force participation of women in India? Because, if that education is translated to, like, say, higher incomes, that would even lead to worse effects.
Right.
That's
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting observation, and I think it's something definitely worth looking at, especially given that labor force participation is extremely low in India. It's been sort of falling over time. Whether that has to do with power within marriage, whether if the women sort of outcompetes their husbands, whether that sort of leads to more domestic violence, and whether that causes them to sort of drop out of labor force, is something which is very interesting. And I do not think that there has been any systematic exploration of this question from this perspective. So this is definitely something that's worth exploring.
right. And like, also there are other things that I would like to ask you. For example, why you take those assumptions of, like, what are the reasons for the assumptions that you make in your estimation and all. But before that, let me just ask Harjot ji to give her comments on the on today's lecture, and what she thinks, what is her take from the policymaker's perspective. So over to you, ma'am. Are you there?
Yeah, thank you, Ashima. Thank you very much. Good evening to everybody. A very interesting lecture, definitely makes people think. And I would like to congratulate Punarjit Roy Chowdhury and Gaurav Dhamija for their excellent paper. And it's quite thought provoking, I must say. Though, as women, I think we do understand this effect much more easily than I think without the research, also, I think we are quite. Uh, we do know that this happens in society, but your research now gives empirical evidence for this kind of a thing which women are facing in society. Uh, in fact, I was remembering this old film which was made with Amitabh Bachchan and Jaya Bhaduri, Abhiman, which is basically about two singers, and the women, the wife outshines the husband and leads to a lot of marital problems. And what he was saying, emotional and other kinds of abuse of the wife happens unless or until she finally leaves the singing and goes back to her village. So this was made, I think, in the 70s, I believe. So uh, people even then were thinking about these issues about how women are not able to uh, move ahead, or how men are unable to take to the fact that maybe their partner is doing much better than them. But that is one part of the problem. I would just like to ask one thing that, of course, this empirical study is with relation to domestic violence in India. Have you found this kind of a correlation even in Western countries, advanced countries with very high GDPs, or maybe they have crossed this line? They must have also had this in one stage of development, but maybe now with more and more women coming out in their labor force, which is more or less equal, or at least much better than the developing countries, the situation there in those countries would be interesting to watch. And then the second question, which of course we were all debating about what the policymakers should do, given this empirical evidence of the effect of hypergamy violation on domestic violence in India. Um, I think maybe we should now be concentrating more on educating the male counterpart in India, because I think we need to really tackle the patriarchal norms and what they've been in their subconscious, they've been fed right from their birth about what is the role of women in society or in a family, um, because they assess their partners based on what they've seen their mother do in their households. And in their lifetime, they must have seen their mother equates to their father a lot of times, because at that time, the general refrain heard in all households was that who is the breadwinner in the family, who is the bread earner, and if I'm the bread earner, if I'm bringing the money on the table, then my decision prevails, no questions, and I would not brook any argument about it. So maybe I think problem also is in that sense that how do you treat people to become more equal and to let go of the status quo, which gives them a higher position in their own mind at least, and make them believe that yes, equality is just not a norm in the constitutional book or something we debate about in seminars or things like, but something which we need to imbibe in our daily lives and become more, what you say, liberated in our minds rather than liberated in words. So those kind of issues, because this kind of violence is just not restricted only to in the domestic realm. It also happens in the work, in the offices, in the places where women work, and sometimes they can take very violent forms. They also have a lot of sexual overtones for women working in the offices. And of course, we also know that there is a glass ceiling also, and generally women also face it in their lifetimes once or twice, where they end up having somebody questioning their ability only on the basis of their gender, not on the basis of their work or what they've been doing or what they've been giving. So definitely something for the policymakers like us to ponder about. But I think policies will not change unless or until such kind of empirical evidence is basically printed or published in newspapers, or is debated upon in legislative assemblies, or is debated upon in the higher echelons of government where the policies are made. And I think if we just scratch the surface, we'll find that men, being men, just because you read about equality or you think about equality doesn't mean you equal. Subconsciously, we all seem to be having our own thought processes and our own things about it. And even in the higher echelons or the secretaries of government, you will find this kind of attitude where women generally face this thing that increasingly we heard the line, because I think I come from a hypergamy violation marriage only, because as per your this thing, our score would be 0 because we are both of the equal standing. Me and my husband are both of the 92 batch IAS. So we are equal in pay scales and paychecks and all the perks that we get and our postings also. So of course, those issues happened. And I think I was supposed to give a talk on to one of my alma mater students about women in civil services. I think in that also I was reading the various articles, and again the same thing comes there also, that there are very few women in the civil services at the higher level. And even I was very disturbed to read that even in the year 2018-19, the male probationers in the IS Academy of India in Missouri still feels that women are husband hunters in the academy. They come there only to find husbands, as if finding a husband seems to be the be all and end all of a woman in India. Whatever your achievements, I think ultimately a woman is generally taken to task only on 2 issues. Are you married? Do you have children? If your answer is no to both of them, I think your other achievements just seem to pale off. So I think we need to really change the way we look at women. Why living in a marriage, or why even being married, is such an important thing for women in India. I think if you're quite economically independent and you can definitely chart your own course. The other issue which always comes in domestic violence is the issue of children. Women become extra susceptible the moment a child is involved in that marriage. If there is no child, I think empirical studies will prove that majority of the women are willing to take a harsh decision and walk out from that abusive relationship, or even take their chances outside, even if they are not very educated, or even if they do not have at that time anything to fall back on. But whenever a child is involved, I think majority of the women, whether they are from the lower strata or right up to the upper strata, they suddenly have a lot of guilt issues, and they feel that maybe the decisions that they are taking are not okay for their children, and society also generally are against them for those reasons. So I think somewhere we also need to know the issue about children, because just like in the patriarchal norms, looking after children is the sore and square responsibility of women in a family, not the man. Majority of the men, whether they're working in any place, feel very happy to be unable to answer correctly whether their child is in which class or in which school, and they feel very happy about it, and they seem to be smiling and beaming. Oh, I don't know, my wife knows kaun si class mein padhta hai type bacha. So that kind of issues are there here. And enforceable legislation, as you're saying, for protection from domestic violence. Again, when we are actually implementing domestic violence norms in India, we find that we also hit the wall again and again in that so-called non-transparent line in the minds of people who are actually implementing it. And they have their own norms about, ये तो ठीक है मैडम, इस पे थोड़ी ना ज्यादा सोचना चाहिए, तो इसकी गलती थी, इसको she behaved in a bad manner and she got what it was coming. Matlab, this kind of an attitude persists in the male folk, even in females at the lower level, which you need to keep training them again and again into psychological and other things so that you get those cobwebs out of their mind. And it's a, as I'm from JNU, as they used to say in Marxist ideology, it was very difficult to get your ideological apparatus right, because it's been layers and layers and layers of programming on your mind. So how do you get that programming corrected in just a few seminars or maybe a few training sessions? And in majority of the training sessions also, people do not speak up unless or until I think we have an objective test afterwards. But I'm digressing more into the implementation part of it. But a very, very interesting article. And just one more question as to, do we see some kind of a plateauing of this hypergamy violation or its effect on domestic violence when society starts becoming more equal, or as the GDP rises, or is there some silver lining on the dark cloud, or it's only we as a policymaker or the government officials who are sorely and squarely going to change society by force or by making laws which sometimes the society doesn't seem to be buying or not implementing at its own will. Dowry prohibition, for example. Dowry is prohibited in India, but it is openly traded, and in most of the cases, you are unable to prosecute people because people who are supposed to prosecute are also people who have taken dowries in their own lifetime, and they do not believe in prosecution for dowry violations. And domestic violence also, if the average person on the street or of administration, whether he's a constable, whether he's a panchayat sevak, or whether he's a junior engineer, or anybody at that level, or even senior people, if they themselves in their mind believe that violence against women, because of their patriarchal upbringing, they believe that it's okay, equal, बहुत ज़्यादा नहीं मारा है तो ठीक ही ठाक है, थोड़ा बहुत तो चलता ही है. So then you are unable to basically bridge that gap between what should be and what is actually there on the street. So, but that is, I think we need to really, I think such kinds of empirical studies must be also shown to the policymakers, maybe in the parliament or maybe in the legislative assemblies, so that people also know, okay, we believe that, okay, education for women really is a game changer, but education for women per se can also have such negative consequences in the short run, or in some cases, or which also need to be taken to task by some other policy initiatives, or by another kind of a policy which basically meets these gaps. And yes, of course, diverse laws in India should be made more liberal so that people can get divorced easily. So I believe still many of the divorce laws, if it's a Hindu marriage divorce law, the man is allowed much more grounds for divorce than a woman. It's only if you go for a special marriage act that the male and the female are on an equal footing for getting a divorce in India. Otherwise, as far as the Hindu Marriage Act, or I'm not very sure about any other marriage acts. I've not done that much of a study, but the two main ones are these only. It is a very lopsided affair. So the woman, once married, is unable to take an exit from a abusive relationship, unless or until it's a consent for a mutual divorce, then it is faster. But if one party is contesting, then it can take you at least a decade to get a divorce, getting a divorce from an abusive relation and starting all over again. So those kind of issues also need to be changed if we want more and more women there. And of course, independent women, maybe unmarried women are also, we need more unmarried women in the society also, maybe that is also required, that women per se are saying increasingly that we don't want to get married. So I think many things, but as long as society is able to give that kind of a freedom to a woman, I think we will be able to do it much. But yes, definitely we'll be looking at our own domestic violence laws based on this, and also do some empirical studies in Bihar maybe about whether we find these things in Bihar. Of course, I know we do, but as you say, that it will be only a hypothesis unless and until I can also prove it with empirical evidence garnered from various villages and blocks of Bihar that yes, it is true. But a very thought-provoking and a very interesting study. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to listen to this talk, and my best wishes to both Punarjit Roy Chowdhury and Gaurav Dhamija. Excellent work. Congratulations. Thank you.
Thank you, madam. It was earlier, whatever you suggested, I completely agree. And for the fantastic insights, thank you very much. I think how you summarize the paper, or how you sort of discuss the policy implications of the paper, that was not something that I could do. So thank you very much. The two questions that you ask are sort of interrelated. One is that, can I sort of suggest of some kind of silver lining? Is there some evidence that in developed countries things are better, or when a country develops, is this sort of going to change? Well, I don't, I can't answer that, because I don't think there's been work such as this done in developed countries, because all the sort of evidences that I suggested were from different developing countries. Uh, in developed countries, there's been some work on how relative status affects women's decision making, or how that affects sort of gender violence, not just domestic violence, other kinds of gender violence. Also mental health. The evidence is quite mixed there. Some papers do find that as women become more powerful in marriage, they become less susceptible to different kinds of violence, or they become more real, have higher say in decision making. But some studies also do show that, when women become more powerful within marriage, their mental health depletes in developed countries. So I do not think there's one clear-cut answer, even if you look at developed countries, on how women's relative status change translates into the change in their well-being. So yeah, so that's what I can say about that. But overall, I think I agree with all what you said. That sort of, in which is the things that are in regards to how to change the attitudes, or how to sort of change the upbringing itself of male child. In fact, just to sort of share an anecdote, I was reading somewhere that, we in Indian society, we talk about raising girls as boys, right? You say that you should raise your girls as boys. Maybe it's time to raise boys as girls, so that when they really grow up, they understand the issues that they are completely sort of oblivious about. And maybe that's one way to sort of go forward and address issues of gender violence in India.
Yeah, true, very true. True. In Bihar, we are also contemplating a gender transformative policy at this particular incident, because when we have done our own review of our own various programs, we found that we really need to do something more and go beyond the symptoms, because the child marriage, dowry prohibition, like these are symptoms of the malaise, which needs to be tackled right from the roots itself. And we also have a decreasing sex ratio at birth in Bihar in many districts. So we also need to tackle that issue, because unless or until the worth of a girl child or a woman is seen as an individual and an equal individual, and somebody who can also take a family or everybody ahead, these issues persist, and one really needs to basically empower women and change the societal mindset about girls. And as we are saying, even very educated people are equally resistant to change, as we found in the Indian Army, the Indian, the IMAs. They were really, really fighting against it, not to open those last bastions to women. That basically it is a problem of the men folk. They believe that if women come into the academy, with initially it was the IPS, of course, IPS initially also women were there, starting from the first women IPS, but in the army also, I believe they have to change the way they interact, the way they talk about it. And even if you look at films, whether they're talking about bravery or they're talking about the fatherland, motherland, India, and its neighbors, it's a very jingoistic kind of a narrative in which you're trying to basically use very cuss words for each other, even on this thing. I don't think, how can you be talking about India as your mother and then talking about such cuss languages? such horrible words on the border itself and fighting on those words. In fact, jokingly, I also said that we, the women, also need some cuss words on male, maybe tere baap ki, tere behan ki, whatever, bhai ki, because it's really, I don't know who came up with these kind of abuses, but they're all based on women. So maybe things are going to change, and it's very heartening to see the Supreme Court coming very strongly about various issues, whether it is women entering temples or women entering the last bastion, the army or the armed forces as equal members. So I believe we seem to be moving in the right direction all over, but pace seems to be a little slow.
That's why in Bihar government is known to have implemented a lot of policies which are targeted towards this gender equality, to generate gender equality, like
the Kanya Uthan Yojana, number one, is all about a woman, right from the time a girl child is born till the time she even basically clears the UPSC or the BPSC or any other higher education thing. She is given money at various stages of her life so that she can study. Of course, school education for girls all over the country, including Bihar, is free. Bihar has also done a lot of reservations for women in various government jobs. So basically, the thinking is that if a girl is studying, and then she should also take a rightful place in society in a job, especially a government job. And in the government, definitely, we need more women so that the women perspective on policies and the women perspective and other things also comes. Recently, the government of Bihar has also taken a very historic decision in which they have also now taken out those circulars saying that in each and every department, they should try to make a woman as their head or HOD. So right, starting from the panchayat level to the secretariat. Of course, you still need women officers for that at that appropriate level, but at least the thinking is right. And somehow the government of Bihar presently is very vocal about women's rights, is trying to do a lot of things. And there have been some very heartening results in the last decade or so. Bihar seems to be improving and taking a lot of strides in the right direction.
This brings me to a question, Punarjit, from your paper. Like, if there are some policies where, like, there are lots of these policies where you give cash transfers to the women, versus those policies where you kind of give them jobs, to those where you're trying to enable them to. So from your analysis, do you think that these policies would have different effects on domestic violence? Say, for example, uh, like in your paper, you look at the education as a measure of hypergamy. So I was wondering that what if we take the economic status alone, say incomes, or whether you have a, or as like Harjot ji was saying that the designation on ranks of a job, um, is that would that make a difference? And that is also like some people are also asking similar questions. So say when you have a job and you are bringing in some sort of resources to the family, maybe that count sort of outweighs your this patriarchal thinking, where you are more educated and not employed. So you question some of the beliefs, but overall you are sort of still you have these struggles and other things, which is again related to what Harjot was saying, that is it that with the level of economic, as the economy grows, do you expect this to reduce? So what is your take on this?
No, I don't. I mean, what you're suggesting that, I mean, these are different ways to sort of, conceive economic power within marriages or sort of within couples. So one thing I can say based on my research, that there's some result which I haven't presented, but there's some result to show that if you just look at income for the last 1 year, even then get similar results. That if women sort of out-earn their husband, you get similar results. But looking at other factors and how that interacts with the relative status of women, those could be interesting things to look at, and especially important, I think, because this effect is something that we're observing. But are there some other sort of variables which could sort of offset these negative effects, which could interact with these the relative status variable and offset these effects? Those are, I think, some interesting things to look at. That as you were saying, that maybe they are unemployed, but that their attitudes are different or something like that. So I think overall there are many things to sort of look at. So this is sort of a very preliminary, or I would say, sort of one of the first results that show empirical results that show that there's a causal effect. But I think there's more to do in this, in sort of fine-tuning this result or these results, and sort of aligning it with policy, or coming up with more concrete policy prescriptions. Yeah, I mean, that's what I can say.
Right. So I think there are a few questions. First, Dr. Shanghamitra wants to ask a question. Are you there, ma'am?
Yeah, hello.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Dr. Sanghamitra. I work with an organization called UN Women. And this is one of the areas that we primarily work on. And some of the findings that you have talked about are very, very contradictory to what we work on. So that's why I would like to point those out, and maybe for the other audience who are not working on these areas, it might be some information to them. But first of all, congratulations for at least attempting to do an economic analysis of it, although half of it went over my head, but I will definitely want to go through the paper to understand the economic dimensions of it, because currently also, just recently, we have also conducted a COVID, post-COVID or COVID times analysis of a situation of women. And we found that irrespective of the class or irrespective of the employment situation, the violence had risen. Of course, violence is a pre-existing situation, but it has also risen. So this falsifies what you are talking about, because if hypergamy was the issue, then we know that a major chunk of Indian women lost their jobs. So then the violence shouldn't have been higher. So if I go by that logic, somewhere I'm having doubts. So that's why one thing is there. Other thing is, I feel the primary aspect that we miss in these conversations is the existence of a requirement for a social norm change. Because what you are saying that men are not used to it, or as Harjot ji also very rightly pointed out, a few of the instances where women themselves are in a very problematic situation. And this is something that we see across the states. We are working with lot many states, and we find these factors being predominantly present. So somewhere or the other, even this title that you have, Don't Cross the Line, has a connotation which says that, अच्छा ये एक norm है, इसमें stick करो. अगर नहीं करते हो, then you are creating a problem. So the title itself is problematic for me as a social scientist. So sorry, I'm not trying to critique you. I'm just trying to tell you as a gender expert or a feminist what I see as problematic in this. So I hope you will you can get the vibe of what I'm talking about, because somewhere or the other, the entire structure of patriarchy across the states, and as Harjot ji pointed out about Bihar, I can cite many other states where supposedly the matriarchal situation is better, yet there is a lot of violence. So kahin na kahin, we'll always have to remember the power dynamics per se of the patriarchal thought process is the root cause. Until and unless we are able to address that, unless we are able to kind of do away with it. Of course, it is not going to happen in our generation. This is a work that will go on, and maybe in some other generation, they will have a fair state where everybody would be equal. Also, one thing that you pointed out about the foreign 1 out of 3 data that you cited, that is actually global data. That is not India's data. In India, the scene is different. So when you are talking about global also, we see, and also when you're talking about domestic violence in marriage, you are actually missing out the IPV in outside of marriage. So there are many forms of IPV that happens, and there are many types of institutions that we are part of. And so that's why this study actually limits the universe in my understanding, right? So that way, if you are citing NFHS data also, NFHS does not have information on IPV beyond marriage. So that itself is a huge lacuna that we are fighting for. We're talking to the concerned departments to actually include it, to make it more open, because India otherwise has been quite open in many aspects, point in cases, abortion laws and all. So that way, if we are able to...
Please limit
Sorry.
the time of your question.
Yeah, I will. I actually, Ashmita, I actually do not have any questions because I have not read the study. I would really want a copy of the study, and then I would like to probably I'll email Punarjit the queries that I have, and he could respond to me. But I just wanted to point out that social norm per se is the catch where the change has to be. And I congratulate the researchers from economic background to have taken up this study, because otherwise the hardcore economists don't take up this kind of studies. And that is one of the, at least other than, I think we have invited Jayatiji and a couple of other economists in this.
So now let me just quickly move on.
Yeah,
to the
sure.
next
Thank
question.
you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So there are 2 questions that are typed here. One is from Soumya, who is asking, would you distinguish between domestic violence versus intimate partner violence? Are we isolating the effects of violence from other family members beyond the spouse? And how would hypergamy domestic violence association work out in patriarchal societies with stronger matrilineal inclinations, such as Kerala? Do you suspect results to be drastically different?
Okay, the answer to the first question is that basically I'm looking at violence within marriage. So IPV or the domestic violence that I'm sort of referring to here is completely sort of violence that's been inflicted by the husband onto the women. So that's how we define domestic violence here. There could be other sort of aspects of IPV or IPV coming from other members of the family, from both the natal family as well as the husband's family. We are not looking into that. The second question is, how would my findings carry over to states like states which are less patriarchal, right? Like, or where literacy rates are high, sort of states which are sort of thought to be better for women. I don't know, and I would not like to comment on that because I have done or extended my work for looked at state-wise analysis. One reason is that my method requires a big amount of data, and just looking at every particular state might be hard. I'm not sure, but I mean, I can try doing that. But as of now, we haven't looked at state-wise results. What we have done, although, is looked at results separately for northern versus southern India. And you would expect that in southern India, patriarchy is lesser. Our results are similar. There's not much difference between northern and southern India. So whether you would want to extrapolate those results and say that, you know, that means that in less patriarchal societies, this effect persists, that's up to you. I wouldn't want to make any extrapolation based on that.
Right. So let me just quickly ask the next question that has been already typed, which is talking about a particular case study in Ranchi, where the domestic violence drastically decreased after the women were introduced to auto driving because of rise in incomes. So I would like to, so though there are very few in number, they stated that, so are you talking about a particular survey that you did? Neha Prasad, like in commercial driving, the rate of, sorry, I'm just like missing the question. So I think this, Neha, would you just quickly ask your question? I cannot read it here.
I think Ashmita, I'll just respond to this. I think I'm understanding what she's saying here. I think these are two. So these are two different things. So what I'm looking at and what you are looking at, I'm sort of referring to Neha Prasad's question. These are two different things. When I'm looking at the effect of hypergamy violation on domestic violence outcomes, we sort of use a method that holds other factors constant, right? So it's just two women, one from hypergamous marriage and one from non-hypergamous marriage, and how their exposure to domestic violence differs, and all other factors are held constant, and that's the sort of essence of causal analysis. What you found is basically taken two women, one who was introduced to auto driving, other who did not get that chance, and you see that the person who was introduced to auto driving, that person has lesser exposure to domestic violence. So for that person, domestic violence fell. Now, what happens in the background? You don't know. When you're just looking at a survey and looking at two different individuals, what you're actually measuring is an association. So whether there are any omitted factors, whether there are any factors that are omitted with both participation in auto driving and domestic violence, you really cannot hold that you cannot hold that fixed. So whether your results are causal or not, one that's something that needs to be thought. And secondly, what you are just, if you just take two women, one who's an auto driver and the other person who is not an auto driver, whether the first person violates hypergamy or not, and the second person violates hypergamy or not, you don't have information on that. Now, you are looking at a variable which is very different from the variable that is my treatment variable. So, I'm not making any tall claims that, okay, you shouldn't educate women, you shouldn't sort of empower women. In fact, even if my analysis would be even valid to the extent that, there are two women, one who is more educated than the other, but if in hypergamy violation status, they don't sort of differ if they are both in the treatment and control group, then my results would be basically consistent with yours. So you reach that point that you exceed your husband's status, and only then you are sort of exposed to more domestic violence. So in your case, the woman who has higher status and the woman who has lower status, they could potentially be from the same treatment group, and both of them might not have reached their husband's status, and therefore the woman who is of higher status has low exposure to domestic. So all these kinds of effects are consistent with my results, and therefore I don't see any sort of inconsistency with what you find, which is broadly in line with the literature on women empowerment. I mean, of course, there is a huge literature which suggests that empowering women is important, right? And otherwise people wouldn't making policies for that. What we are suggesting is, empowering women is right, but there are some riders to it. There are some caveats which you should take into account.
If I could also just add to it, Shiva, if you have the time. Just two things about the two questions, as Punarjit Roy Chowdhury has already said. women auto drivers in Ranchi are having a better status today than what they were having tomorrow is a very also depends upon what kind of a relative aspect are we looking at. Maybe earlier they were very badly off and now they seem to be on a better graph because they've started earning. But I think it can be explained in another manner that if you've seen that film Thappad, I think people have different reactions to that film Thappad. So we had different audiences for that Thappad movie screening, and we found that there were some young girls who had come from different backgrounds and who were just getting their skill training, and they were giggling away to glory, and they felt कि पता है एक थप्पड़ के लिए इतना तमाशा क्यों करना है? मतलब for them, getting beaten up in their households is a very normal routine thing, and they basically think that अगर बहुत ज़्यादा पीट दिया कि अस्पताल ले जाने की जरूरत पड़ गई तो that is bad. आगे पीछे थोड़ा सा चोटी खींच दिया या धक्का दे दिया या एक थप्पड़ मार दिया is okay routine, मतलब nothing to be taken to task about. So they have a different mindset about whether your spouse can be giving you that kind of a treatment. Similarly, if you look at the Ranchi auto drivers, that is one aspect of society, then how do you explain domestic violence in the upper echelons of society where the women is in a very better state and the man is also equally learned, the women is equally learned, they do not have any problems as far as economic issues are concerned. But there also you find there is a large amount of domestic violence if you do not agree with somebody and all that. And thappad is also that kind of an issue only where basically here's a lady who's putting a line and saying ki, no, you cannot hit me. Come what may, if we are equal, you cannot hit me.
Interrupt you, but I think Madhuri Das had raised her hand and she wanted to ask something.
No, Asmita, it's perfectly all right. Let Harjot ma'am finish, please. Huh? I'll come in after that. Yeah. Thank you, ma'am. Please go ahead. Yeah.
We have just like 2 minutes left.
Yeah, yeah, sure, no problem.
Please ask your question.
No, please. I think, no, let ma'am complete, Ashmita. I can hold my question. I'll do it later, maybe. Yeah. Thank you. Ma'am, please go ahead.
Yeah.
And the other thing, of course, was about the Kerala experience with matrilineal societies and all that. But I think if we just scratch the surface of Kerala also, increasingly a lot of data is coming out from Kerala, which gives a different picture about Kerala and domestic violence. And we find a huge number of dowry cases in Kerala, which basically undermine the very fact that it's a matrilineal society where the so-called status of women is supposed to be better than man. But it seems to have been distressing over the years. So I think there is a lot of data which is coming from that state also, which gives a different kind of a picture. So before giving an answer to such complicated issues, I think anybody will have to go in depth into it and exactly find out what were the issues involved, and then maybe we can give an answer on that. But I think relatively speaking, you can't put a paper here and then take it to somewhere else and say, okay, this finding doesn't hold true for that. Just trying to say that. Thank you.
This matrilineal society in Kerala is also limited to, I think, a few limited castes within the Hindu and the others. They do not follow the same pattern. The same, I think, is true for Northeast. Like there are some tribes that are matrilineal but in the same state, there could be others that are not. So
in some manners, I think this is also a stereotype about some states, which on empirical analysis doesn't seem to be holding true.
Yeah, so I had seen this paper which was doing an experimental study in 2 tribes in Northeast. One was matrilineal and one was not. And then they were looking at the power relationships. So basically, it showed the matrilineal society, the women behaves as the man, and like you expect everything else what you expect in a matrilineal society to hold. But then these are very narrow tribes, and like macro analysis like this cannot, I think, look at those. So yeah, I think we are just at 4:30 and it's about time to end the conversation. Thank you, Punarjit, for patiently answering all the questions. And he has posted the most recent version of the paper here, so people can have a look at it whenever you want and contact for more questions. So thanks again for coming.
Thank you, Ashmita. Thank you so much, everyone, for making time and attending this lecture. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Asma. Thank you. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. Thank you, Punarjit.